Hello everyone. Today I'm back with my round 3 game of the second day of the first Banglore Grandmaster tournament where I was playing in category B. So without further ado, let's go get into the game. So the previous games, I'll still keep the analysis board on. I was playing white against Vishwaswaran N, and strangely both of us didn't play this game well. He made a sacrifice that was not necessary, and somehow I became too conservative and miscalculated some strategies. And at the end, because of time pressure, I blundered a move that you will see and what happened. So the game started with the Giuoco Piano of the Italian opening. Very simple, following the opening principles. I all generally like generally play c3, d4, and try to get a better center. But since my opponent was of a lower age, he was very young, I think 14 or 15 years old. I thought maybe we'll go for something more positional and let's see what happens, because what I have observed is kids are more focused on tactics, and if we put them in a positional game, they tend to make some positional inaccuracies, and you can take advantage of those. So I played knight c3, knight f6, b3, d6, and here generally people play bishop g5, but the issue is black hasn't castled. So if black hasn't castled, black can actually play h6, bishop h4, and g5. And your bishop is taken h5, and black would not again castle on the king side. Black would develop the bishop to e6, queen to d7, and then castle on the queen side. And if you castle on the king side, then there are high probabilities that black actually might attack you. So I played bishop e3, that is the reason. And if black captures bishop on e3, I'll capture on with the f pawn, and after short castling, my rook will have an open file, and I also have a good control on the center. The pawn on e3 and e4 are doubled, will be doubled, but it's more like for gaining something, you have to lose something. And here I am gaining much more than I am losing. That the pawn on e3 is not that big of a weakness. And playing d4 also gives me good control on the center. And my rook, again, f file is very strong with my bishop pointing to f7. I will have some good attacking chances or good positional chances. So my opponent here played bishop g4. And I think the same concept applies, that if you're playing bishop to g4, I can always play h3, g4 and kick your bishop out. So, but before that, I exchange the bishop, and like I mentioned, younger kids, they are more tactical oriented, and what I have observed recently is that kids have this tendency of memorizing openings. So here I feel this kind of structure, double pawns, is something that a person with good fundamental skills would have avoided. My opponent was terrific. He had great skills, but I think he somehow made a few positional mistakes. I played h3, and here before playing g4, I was a bit concerned of knight captures g4, like g4, knight captures g4. And I had calculated that if I capture and black captures, then I cannot actually play bishop f7 sacrifice, because after king f7, knight e5 or g5 checks are not possible. With in case of knight g5 check, let me just show. So our game actually happened on those lines. So I'll just move forward on the game. And bishop g4. So I played rook g1, which was the best move of the position, but let's see some other options. There, these were not possible here, but they are ideas that might actually be helpful in your games. So one of them is bishop f7, king f7, And you can play knight g5 check with a discovered attack on the bishop. This is not working here because then black has queen takes g5 and the queen defends the bishop. And the other option is knight cap knight captures e5 check. Again, this is not working because knight captures e5 and the knight will defend the bishop. Another calculation I was thinking of is knight b1 and then knight b1 knight to d2. But this is actually very slow because when you play knight b1, then black has knight d4, knight b1 is kind of forced, and then queen f6 is there, and you do not have a good defense for this knight. So after considering all these options, I thought maybe I should not play g4, but then I looked at. So what I realized is that he has just one more attacker more than me, and I can always play bishop b5 to pin the knight. The issue was after bishop b5, he had this. If I directly play bishop b5 here, he has queen f6, and again I do not have a way to save the knight. So I just needed one more defender, and there I looked at the move rook g1. So if the bishop moves back or bishop captures knight, it would simplify the position, and I would have an extra piece for 2 pawns, which is kind of winning for me. And if the bishop moves back, I can still put my rook in, and my rook defends the knight. So I'll get here. I do not have a direct way of defending, but by attacking him and forcing him to play a defensive move, I'll gain this time to bring my rook in and defend. So I had seen this move rook g1, h5, and then I played bishop e5. Now if black plays queen f6, I'll play rook g3, and then I don't think black has a way to further continue the attack. I had thought of castling and f5 to open up the f file, and that is what my opponent did. But I captured. And look, these pawns, they are just too weak. Even the a pawn is isolated. So I would say maybe all these 4 pawns combined together are worth like 2 pawns. So, and he's already a piece down for 2 pawns. Here I had calculated something like queen e2, f5, queen e3, pawn captures, and then knight captures pawn. And if d captures knight, the knight captures bishop, pawn captures, rook captures, and it was getting complicated. But then I realized that I can simplify the position by capturing the bishop, capturing the pawn, and I would still be attacking two of his weak pawns. And I would gain back the pawn, and I will have 2 pieces for a rook, which is also a good favorable action for me. So I computer suggest queen a2, and queen a2 I think is the best move in the position, but it kind of seemed complicated, and I believe the variation I chose is simpler and still gives you that advantage, which is sufficient enough to win. Later I made some mistakes and I didn't play the best moves, which gave him some chances, but again, had I played the better moves, he would have no chances. So I captured the bishop, pawn captures, knight captures pawn, queen h4. So I think he just has a lot of weak pawns, and I could have grabbed either. I think knight c6, I'm removing like the weakest pawn, while g4 pawn is kind of still strong. And I thought he has some G3, Queen G3 ideas and some checks. Even though nothing is happening, I had calculated that, but still, I thought, why bother? Just capture the better pawn and have no, you don't give him any. F5. So here, if I capture the pawn, then I didn't like this position with my king opening up. I don't want my king to be stuck in the center. I could have played the knight somewhere else, but I was thinking if somehow I have to move my queen out, then there's this queen h1 check and I would lose my rook. and I didn't want to have to go through all those thoughts. So I played knight e3, which is very solid because I can always play knight f1 to defend, and plus I am putting pressure on the f5 pawn. Rook a e8. So now I cannot capture this pawn with the knight because rook will capture the knight and this pawn is pinned. So I would lose the knight. So, so f5. So he played rook e8. And here I thought I had two options: Queen E2, which computer says the best move, and Queen D2. Queen E2 was my first option that I considered, but I thought after Queen E2, Pawn F4, let's say Knight moves to F1, Pawn F3, and you have to eventually move the Queen to D2. And there's the other option F4, Knight F1, and Queen G5 or Queen H6. So if you castle, then f3 check, and there are some complication. And with queen d2, I thought it's relatively more simpler, and if pawn captures, you just capture with the knight, and this knight defends everything. If I didn't play queen to f2 c2, let's say I played something else, let's say a3, then there was this threat of pawn captures, knight captures, and rook captures knight. I do not have enough time to capture the rook because queen captures f2 is a check. I can play the motion show. If I capture this, he captures the knight, and I cannot capture the rook because I will get checkmated. So queen had to come in and defend the pawn on f2. So it had to be either queen e2 or queen d2. And somehow I felt queen d2 is more simpler. So queen d2, pawn f4, then knight cannot go to g2 or f5 or any other square because of queen h1 check, and it's a skewer on the rook on a1. So if king moves forward, I would lose the rook. Knight f1, g5, and castling. Here he played g4, and then I realized maybe he's having some pass pawns, and I just felt a little bit uneasy with the idea of allowing g3. So I played queen e1, stopping any ideas of g3, rook e7. And here I believe I became over defensive. I could have simply pushed my pawns forward, but I played knight e2, discarding g3 and putting some pressure on f4. If he plays f4, then knight e2 g3, and my position is solid and he does not have any chances. Rook g7, pawn to a3, opening up a space for the king to move out. Rook e7, king b1, c4, and I noticed that. So the reason my queen was stuck here, or I was not keen on moving the queen out, was because I was losing this pawn on f2. But then I noticed I can play queen b4, queen captures f2, queen captures rook, and if queen captures knight, I'll just move my rook in. Or I can also give some checks and cap put some more pressure on my opponent. Even something like maybe something like queen b4, queen captures, and I can give a check and play rook d2 if the king moves here, and knight e3, and knight defends the rook, and then rook h1 is actually a checkmate threat. So I had seen this, so I played in this position. I played queen b4, attacking the rook. The rook moved to f7, and I thought I can capture this pawn, but after he captures, I thought these two pawns are becoming too strong with the queen there, and he might have some real chances. And I wanted to defend the pawn, but I didn't want to put my queen on the passive e1 square. So I put my queen on c5. So again, still putting pressure on the pawns as well as defending the pawn. Rook e8, and I thought, okay, I can simply capture c6, and again the same thing. He cannot capture f2 because the rook will get captured. I feel rook e8 was not a good move. Rook, then e7. And again, I wanted my queen on this diagonal, but and I saw that I can give a check, gain a tempo, and then capture the pawn. So I did that. And by this time, if we notice, I have two knights for a rook, which is one extra point, and I also got two extra pawns. So I have three extra points than my opponent. So even if I lose a piece at this position, or this piece, one of my knights get removed, it would still be somewhat equal in terms of points. Pawn captures d3 again. If I capture on with the rook, then I lose my pawn here on e4, and then his can with his rook on the open file, he can have some fighting chances. So I didn't want allow that. Queen s3, and I thought his idea was queen f3, so I thought I always have queen h5 check, or I have knight c3. And after queen f3, here I made a mistake. I had seen knight f c3, and I knew that there was no good moves for my opponent to continue because everything is well defended. But I thought if I give up this pawn, I already have three extra points. So what if I can give up this pawn to exchange the queens? Then that would make the position simpler. So I played queen c2, queen captures, and knight c3. Just offering a trade of queens, and he cannot avoid this trade because let's say in this position the only safe square the queen has is f3, but then after knight h2 he's he cannot play queen there because I have knight g4. And now I'll stop the analysis board, and the question is why queen g4 is not correct. Maybe you can pause the video and think for a bit and put your answers in the chat. So the answer is this is not possible because after queen h2, wherever the king moves, g6, g7, or g8, there's rook g1 and the queen is pinned, and black will lose the queen. So my opponent, I'll switch on the analysis again. So my opponent captured my queen, king captures, pawn g3. Here I had maybe my last 1 to 2 minutes left on the clock, and I needed to play fast. I thought I'll just give up the knight for two of these pawns. So I played knight d5, and my plan was if pawn g2, I'll just move my knight, let my opponent save the rook, move the rook to g2, and if pawn f3, I'll capture the pawn and give up the knight. After rook captures, I'll capture this pawn, and I still have, I even though I'm an exchange down, I still feel I have the winning advantage. So this is what I had calculated: g2, knight, and here the rook is under attack and the pawn is under attack. So let's say he saves the rook. I play rook g1, and this was what was happened in the game. And somehow I felt f3 is the only move where I can just give up the knight and still have a good position. By points, I have just 1 point ahead, but if you look, the king is completely cut off from the defense of this pawn, and I have four pawns which can become very strong connected passers. With my king also king and knight supporting them. But he played rook g6. I played knight f3, rook g3, and I played knight a4. And this was again on in time pressure. I had few seconds left, and I just touched the piece and I moved it. I had no intention of playing a4. I was thinking more something like king d2, and if he captures, I'll just capture this pawn. And if he plays rook g7, I can bring in the king and save the knight. So something like king g2, and if rook moves, the king moves and saves the knight, and if the rook captures the knight, I still capture this pawn. And I still feel even though computer says it's equal, but I still feel I have some good chances. Yeah, but I I just touched the piece and touch and move applies. So I had to play for, and here I got a little bit nervous after c6 knight c3. I thought he is having some decent chances, maybe rook h3, rook h1, but none of those were actually working. So knight e1, putting pressure on the pawn and forcing him to play f3. So I am not sure why he didn't play f3. F3 seemed such a logical move. Uh, what I had planned was f3, knight d1, stopping f2, and then maybe he would have tried rook h3, rook f1. But he tried rook h3, and I moved my king in f3, and I again moved my king in rook h1. And here I feel he might have missed knight e2, because if I play anything except knight e2, my knight on f3 is protecting the rook on g1, but it's currently pinned. So if my opponent captures my rook, I cannot save my I cannot capture back, and I cannot capture this rook because pawn captures rook is a queen. And if I play something like queen f2, removing the pin and saving the rook, rook captures, and I feel this is oops, not rook, rook c1, and this is not going to be easy to win. Computer even claims it to be equal or a draw position. So there was no other move. I didn't find any other move except knight e2, and but knight e2 I felt simply wins. Knight e2 attacking the rook as well as defending my own rook. Rook move back to g8, king f2, and he played rook b8. I thought even if I lose this pawn, I'm gaining this pawn, and two knights versus a rook with two extra pawns should be winning. King captures, rook captures. I could have captured with the rook, but I thought I want my king to go back to this side. So if I capture with the knight, I'll have this f3 for my king, and all of my pieces would save each other. King f3. He tried attacking the pawn on f4. The knight saves the pawn. King moves and knight moves to d2. And if you notice, this knight saves this knight, which saves this knight. And in other terms, this knight is also protecting the other knight. And it feels all of my pieces are saving each other and helping each other be safe. King comes near the pawns, and all of my pieces are now well coordinated. It's simple technique now. C5. I could have played d5, but I thought e5 check, knight b5 check is simpler and capture the pawn. And again, if you see all my pieces, they are both my knights, they are protecting each other and allowing space for my king to move forward. Also, if you notice all these squares, they are controlled by my pieces. So the king does not have a way to move forward to attack my pawns. Move back. Yeah, maybe his plan was rook c8 attacking the pawn, but I just simply moved my pawn forward. And this square is also controlled by my knight, so I can also play c7 anytime I want. e5. Again, he cannot attack this pawn because all these squares are controlled by my pieces. It's kind of like his king is just jammed. Preferred king c4, moving the king up. And here, I think this was the final mistake. Rook f7, c7. And if king comes to stop the pawn, I have e6, which is a fork. And if rook moves back, I have knight to d6, and the knight will protect the king, and he would lose his rook. Still, this king cannot attack this pawn because all these squares are controlled, and we have to be careful. We cannot checkmate with two knights. So if somehow black finds a way to sacrifice the rook for getting these two pawns, it would lead to a draw. So that was the only thing, only chance I believe black was counting. Rook f1, c8 queen. So My opponent maybe was hoping that he would skewer my king, and after I move my king away, he can win back the queen. But I had already seen this square and I knew knight c3 defended. And at this point, my opponent resigned. So that was the game third. And I'll also further discuss the next games in the upcoming times. If you like the video and do like, you please subscribe to the channel and comment your thoughts on the video.